In 1892, New York, USA, Matthew Harris, a 10-year-old boy with pale eyelids and hair the color of bleached straw, was found lying fully alert and motionless in a boarding house bed, his eyes fixed open for the 1,825th consecutive night. That morning, a nurse noted his heartbeat was normal, his breath steady, yet the boy had not blinked in over 2 hours. His mother, Catherine Harris, a respected textile inspector, claimed the child had never once slept since his birth in 1882, a fact dismissed by physicians until 5 independent witnesses signed statements confirming her claim. Records from Bellevue Hospital in 1889 list Matthew as neurologically intact yet persistently conscious, triggering a classified study involving 4 city departments and the Catholic diocese. Amid growing fear and sensationalist headlines, a government ledger from March 1892 allocated $3,700 to a private containment protocol without further detail. What did the state have to hide about a boy who never slept? Matthew Harris was considered a medical marvel, and the pride of his Irish-born mother, kept clean, educated, and immaculately dressed in second-hand wool suits with brass buttons. But a physician's notebook dated June 3, 1892, noted, "No fatigue markers, no yawn reflex, no REM indication, yet full cognition sustained, triggering a string of sealed reports and nighttime visits by unnamed officials." The first formal record to mention Matthew Harris outside of birth and school documents appears in the March 1889 logbook of Dr. Elias Croft, then a consulting neurologist for Bellevue Hospital. The note is brief, squeezed between pages of syphilis and epileptic cases. Child male 6, no sleep since birth according to mother, no fatigue, pupils responsive. Recommend overnight monitoring. The ink is smudged at the final word, as if the pen faltered. A second entry dated the following week reads, "No REM observed, no behavioral irregularities, child polite, alert, unnerving." Then, refer to DEPT of sanitation for home inspection. The Harris apartment on Orchard Street was 3 floors above a kosher butcher in a tenement known for cracked plaster, thin walls, and the scent of meat and coal smoke. The hallway was perpetually damp, with floorboards that exhaled mildew when stepped on. It was here that Matthew lived with his mother and older sister, Margaret. The father, John Harris, had vanished in 1885, his name listed only once in a census, and never again in police records. Neighbors recalled the child as quiet, nearly silent. Mrs. Beatrice Lindell, who lived directly across the narrow corridor, told an 1893 investigator, "He'd stand at the railing with his hands folded like a statue, never blinked much. You'd pass him on the stairs, and he'd turn his head just slightly, eyes following you, but never a word." What troubled the residents most, they said, was not Matthew's behavior during the day, but the way the apartment light never dimmed at night. In the rear alley, where the tenement windows formed a crooked rectangle of shadow and reflection, the third-floor Harris window remained lit with a steady gas flame, night after night, for years. Even during gas shortages, when the landlord rationed access by padlocking valves, the Harris flame glowed on. No soot build-up, no flicker, no smell of leaked fuel. Just steady, dull yellow light. At St. Patrick's Primary, where Matthew was enrolled from 1888 through 1893, Sister Agnes noted in a disciplinary ledger that he refuses to bow his head for prayer, keeps eyes open at all times, has perfect recall of readings, but speaks them in monotone. Behavior otherwise respectful. The entry is followed by a red ink notation from Headmaster Flynn. Observation requested. Limit engagement. The escalation began in the spring of 1892, when a sanitation clerk named Walter C. Brink submitted an incident report titled "Orchard Infestation, Persistent Complaint." His notes reference multiple visits to the Harris residence. Initial purpose, rodent complaint. Upon inspection, no rodents were found. However, the clerk recorded abnormal temperature patterns, specifying that the child's room registered consistently 10 degrees colder than the adjoining hallway, despite a working radiator. Walter Brink's report contains a peculiar passage. Boy sits in corner chair facing southeast, will not move or acknowledge presence unless directly addressed by mother. No odor, no visible waste or insects. But air quality inside room is thin. Metallic taste reported by all present. Recommend secondary inspection. By May of that year, local physician Dr. Croft was joined by Dr. Florence Rowe, a medical examiner from the Bureau of Vital Records. She brought a mercury thermometer, a tape measure, and 2 clerks. Her diary, later subpoenaed during a Senate subcommittee inquiry, reveals that she visited the Harris apartment 3 times between May and August 1892. On the 3rd visit, she wrote, "Boy is unchanged, skin cool, eyes lucid, pulse steady, breathing shallow, no sign of fatigue. Mother appears convinced of spiritual significance. I see only confusion," she continued. "Apartment lacks typical odors of cooking, urine, or mold. Everything bleached. Curtains stiff with soap. Gaslight hisses at low volume, but flame never dims. Oddest of all, no shadows. The flame gives light, but objects do not cast. The margin contains a note in graphite. Is it the boy?" Matthew never spoke to officials, never initiated conversation with visitors, but there were signs of cognition. When Dr. Rowe dropped a brass pin during her 2nd inspection, it rolled beneath the table. As she bent to retrieve it, Matthew's hand had already extended, pin poised between thumb and index finger. No sound, no instruction, only anticipation. In her words, "He moved before I finished kneeling." Teachers at St. Patrick's were instructed to excuse Matthew from all physical activities. In one incident, during a spring drill session in Tompkins Square Park, Sister Agnes ordered students to lie flat for a wind drill. All students obeyed except Matthew. According to 2 eyewitnesses, he remained standing at the perimeter, facing away from the class, hands by his side. Their park inspector, one Amos Delaney, testified that he was staring directly at the treetops as if waiting for something to fall. No disciplinary action was recorded. One particularly troubling incident was filed by the tenement landlord, Mr. Ephraim Cutter. In a complaint submitted to the New York City Department of Housing on July 8, 1892, he wrote, "Tenants of Units 3B and 3D, Harris is 3C, report continuous murmuring after midnight. Source undetermined. Not music, not language. Not argument. Repetitive cadence, tonal but not tonal. They say it does not pass through the walls but through the floor." By late summer, concern over the case reached the Mayor's Office of Special Affairs, which had authority to oversee matters deemed disruptive to civic confidence. A coded memorandum, later declassified in 1921, included a list of names under the heading Sensitive Observation Targets, Pediatric. Matthews was 3rd on the list. On August 3, 1892, a final visit was conducted under the pretext of a census revision. 2 agents, Mr. Ellis Brown and Mr. Charles Dent, entered the home at 6:12 p.m. Catherine Harris served them tea in ceramic mugs that bore no signs of wear. The table was covered in a linen cloth, damp to the touch, though it had not rained in days. According to Brown's field notes, Boy was seated in far corner of the room, not restrained, not moving. At one point he rose and walked slowly to the bookshelf, withdrew a volume and returned to his seat. He made no eye contact. His movements were exact and noiseless. The book was later identified as The Pilgrim's Progress, printed in 1878. Its pages were brittle and unmarked, except for one, page 47, which bore a penciled line beneath the phrase, "He that is down need fear no fall." As the sun set over the alley behind the tenement, the room did not darken. The Harris gaslight, according to the agents, glowed at identical brightness from their arrival to their exit. When asked how long the boy had remained in that seat, the mother responded, "He has never been tired. He has never needed rest. He listens." Catherine Harris herself was beginning to show signs of strain. Witnesses in the building noted she had ceased shopping locally and instead received parcels from unknown couriers, always wrapped in brown cloth. Her sister Margaret appeared less and less often. In a rare note submitted to the parish priest in September 1892, Margaret wrote, "He doesn't blink anymore. He just watches." Following the agent's visit, official documentation of Matthew Harris slowed, but the private letters and testimonies from those who lived or worked near Orchard Street began to accumulate. In early September 1892, The janitor of the building, Pietro Morelli, an immigrant from Palermo who spoke little English, reported something unusual in his maintenance journal. It was translated a week later by his nephew. Every morning, always same. Room under boy's room has fine grey dust. Window closed, no cracks. Dust on floor, on shelves, on food plate. Like ash, but not from smoke. The substance was sent to the Department of Sanitation, where it was labelled as particulate residue, non-combustive, non-mineral. The texture, according to laboratory clerk Mr. Donald Rees, was soft like talcum, but it repelled water and left a faint metallic scent on the fingers. The samples were not preserved. They vanished from the archive within 2 weeks. Inside the apartment, Matthew's chair had not changed location. Witnesses began referring to it by name, the corner seat. An armchair of faded green fabric with wooden legs and brass casters. It faced an uncurtained window, overlooking a narrow gap between buildings. The chair was never seen empty. When a priest from the Holy Redeemer parish attempted to anoint the room during a scheduled visit, Catherine Harris blocked his entry, stating, "The chair belongs to him, and he does not like to be moved." Father Jerome Nolan, the visiting priest, filed a report with the diocesan office stating, "Room in pristine condition. Gaslight fully functional. No religious items permitted. Mother calm, controlled, excessively formal. Boy's skin tone unnatural. Pale but dry, not anemic. Eyes constantly moist, but do not water." When questioned, he quoted the Book of Job, but only the chapter numbers, refused all other conversation. On September 19, 1892, a fire inspection report was logged under routine compliance. The fire marshal noted that the Harris apartment contained no combustible materials beyond standard textiles. However, he did record that the air inside the unit was noticeably still, describing it as dead air, no draft, no breeze, no echo. He snapped his fingers twice, once near the gaslight, once near the child. "No reverberation," he wrote. The sound did not carry. The file was marked as complete with no violations found. Other tenants began to relocate. The family in Unit 3B, a Polish shoemaker, and his 2 daughters, vacated abruptly after 3 years of tenancy. When questioned, the eldest daughter said only, "We no longer rest." Unit 3D was rented to a single man named Hiram Gull, a customs clerk who took night shifts and kept to himself. In a single letter to his sister in Albany, dated October 2, 1892, he described strange sensations in the walls. Cold like a knife behind the plaster, like someone is standing just beyond reach. Rumors began to surface that Catherine Harris had been approached by journalists. At least one reporter from the Herald attempted contact, but his name never appeared in print. A surviving note, found years later in a bound volume of correspondence, read, "Woman won't answer questions. Offered payment. She closed the door. Boy behind her, watching me, not blinking. Left immediately. Margaret Harris's withdrawal became more visible. Former classmates said she no longer attended mass or lessons. One neighbor spotted her at the market with gloves on her hands, despite the late summer heat. Another observed her standing in the hallway for over an hour, back pressed to the wall, arms folded tightly, head turned toward the door of apartment 3C. On October 17th, a delivery man named William Parr filed a minor injury claim at the city depot, stating that, upon attempting to deliver package to Harris residence, boy opened door before knock, stared at me. I dropped the parcel. Contents not broken, but I felt cold in my chest for hours after, like breathing through copper. He declined to return for future deliveries. By late October, the school issued an internal recommendation to end Matthew's attendance. The document, authored by Headmaster Flynn, cited concerns from faculty and parents regarding behavioral irregularity and ambient disruption. Sister Agnes, in her private letter to the diocese, wrote, "Children will not sit near him. He is never cruel, he simply looks. It is as if he remembers things no child should remember." Matthew did not protest his removal. Catherine withdrew him formally, signing only with her name in ink and a circle around the date. The paper was filed under the Special Circumstances folder in the parish archive, later misfiled and rediscovered during a 1913 audit. After that, Matthew was seen only from the outside. Residents of the tenement and surrounding buildings reported his figure at the window, always seated in the same position, hands on the arms of the chair facing outward. Children on the fire escape would dare each other to wave at him. He never responded. One child claimed, "His eyes followed me even when I ducked behind the rail." In early November, the gas light began to flicker. It had never done so before. A tenant from the second floor reported that, during a brief lapse in pressure across the building, all lights dimmed except for the Harris light. It grew brighter. The event was logged in a maintenance ledger, but never explained. By mid-November, a faint noise was reported by multiple tenants, an intermittent ticking, as of a clock with no chime. The sound was not loud, but constant, particularly at night. It seemed to originate from above, below, or beside one's own room, never fixed, never growing louder or softer. One resident, a war widow named Irene Hale, described it as the sound of waiting. On November 21st, a third incident report was filed by Pietro Morelli. He claimed the Harris apartment door was slightly ajar at dawn. When he pushed it open, he found the main room empty except for the boy in his chair and the gaslight still burning. Catherine Harris was not present. The teacup on the table was full, steam rising. A folded note beside it read, "Do not enter past the flame." Morelli closed the door without further inspection. Catherine returned later that day. When questioned by the building manager, she replied that she had been to the post office. No mail was logged for pickup. No post office confirmed her presence. Matthew's appearance remained unchanged. A medical student who accompanied Dr. Croft during a silent follow-up visit noted, "He does not appear to age. No visible signs of fatigue, growth, or variation in complexion. Muscles do not twitch. Chest barely rises with breath." The escalation reached its quiet peak on the morning of December 1st, 1892. The gaslight, for the first time in recorded memory, was extinguished. Multiple neighbors reported waking in the early hours, unsettled by the absence of the yellow glow. They gathered in the hallway, staring at the closed door of apartment 3C. No sound emerged, no movement. Mrs. Lindell knocked 3 times. The door did not open. The light remained off for exactly 9 hours. Then, without intervention, it reignited. A steady hiss resumed. No one had entered or exited the apartment. When asked later why she had not responded, Catherine Harris said only, "He needed rest." On the morning of January 5, 1893, Dr. Abel Garrison arrived at Orchard Street by appointment. He was not affiliated with Bellevue or the city's medical bureau, but had been commissioned privately by a discreet committee linked to the Office of Public Morals. His background was in forensic psychiatry, though few in the tenement knew what that meant. Wearing a double-breasted overcoat and a watch chain that clicked softly against his vest buttons, Garrison carried only a notebook and a brass instrument case. He did not knock. The door to apartment 3C opened as he raised his fist. Catherine Harris stood in the threshold, her posture stiff, face powdered, voice level. She said, "He will receive you. Please do not speak unless you are certain." Garrison found the boy where reports said he would be, seated in the corner chair beneath the fixed gaslight, eyes open, hands resting precisely on the armrests. The room was warmer than expected. His notes described the sensation as pressurized, as if air were trapped behind the walls and pushing inward. The flame hissed as usual, but Garrison observed no burn mark on the ceiling, no smoke line, no odor. Matthew did not respond to verbal cues. He did not flinch at the shine of a tuning fork passed before his eyes, but when Garrison reached into his coat for a pocket watch, the boy's gaze moved to the chain, tracking it. It was the first movement recorded in hours. Garrison whispered, "Do you recognize the sound of time?" Matthew blinked once. Garrison noted the timestamp. It was 9:17 a.m. 3 days later, Dr. Garrison returned to the committee with 3 pages of observations, none of which were archived. When the committee clerk, Miss Harriet Voss, asked for the original notes in February, Garrison claimed they had been lost in a house fire in Newark. No such fire was logged with city insurance records. Around this time, new construction began on a tenement adjacent to the Harris residence. Crews reported unexplained tool malfunctions along the shared wall. According to foreman Charles Neely, levels and compasses spun irregularly when placed against the bricks. Our surveyor's report noted a magnetic deviation inconsistent with known infrastructure. After 2 weeks, work was suspended without official explanation. More troubling were the testimonies from new tenants placed in the building's rear units. Mrs. Naomi Feld, who moved into Unit 2C in January 1893, reported hearing a soft thudding during the hours between 3 and 4 in the morning. It was rhythmic, she said, not like footsteps. Like a heartbeat inside the walls. She stopped sleeping in her bedroom and eventually relocated to her sister's flat in Brooklyn. The Catholic diocese sent Father Alphonse Redmond in February, this time with formal approval from Bishop Corrigan. Redmond, a former seminary professor, had been tasked with determining whether the Harris case merited religious attention or intervention. He arrived with a copy of the Summa Theologica, a journal, and a vial of holy water concealed in his coat. He was allowed inside without hesitation. Catherine Harris offered no introduction. Father Redmond sat across from Matthew and began to read. He later recorded in his report, "At page 132, I felt the sensation of warmth in my palms, not from fever." It was like the pages themselves emitted heat. The boy's gaze never left my eyes. He sprinkled a few drops of the water onto his own sleeve, then onto the edge of the carpet near the gaslight. The flame flickered once silently and returned to its steady burn. Matthew's mouth opened slightly, but he did not speak. Redmond's final entry before sealing the file read, "This is not a matter of possession or sainthood. It is a stillness I do not understand. The mother does not pray, the boy does not blink. I do not wish to return." Despite his clear warnings, the file was misfiled under routine parish visitation. When retrieved years later, the envelope contained only blank pages. No ink, no imprint, no residue. Meanwhile, an enterprising reporter named Linus Clay from the Evening Telegram took interest in the rumors. Without identifying himself, he rented a room across the alley with a direct line of sight to the Harris window. In a letter to his editor, dated March 3, 1893, he wrote, "I have logged 31 nights observing the child. He has not left the chair once. On March 1st, during a thunderstorm, the glass in my window cracked, but not from wind. It was soundless, as if fractured from within." Clay attempted to photograph the boy through the window. The plate developed black, with a single faint line down the center. On the second attempt, the image showed only the gaslight glowing unnaturally bright. The boy's figure was absent. The developer, a commercial studio in Lower Manhattan, claimed the camera was functioning properly. Clay's third attempt, taken just before dawn, captured what he described as a smear of light, no distinguishable shape, and the distinct outline of a hand on the window facing outward. The negative was confiscated by a city official during a surprise inspection of the telegram offices the following day. Clay refused to pursue the story further. His name disappeared from bylines. He died in 1901 under undisclosed circumstances. Contradictions mounted. School records from St. Patrick's were quietly amended, with Matthew's name removed from all formal enrollment logs. When Sister Agnes was asked to produce his initial admission form, she searched for an hour and returned pale, stating, "It was there." It has been there for 5 years. The file was never recovered. In April, the Department of Sanitation attempted a surprise inspection. The official logbook lists a Mr. D. Calder as responsible. His visit lasted 12 minutes. The only entry in the report is a single sentence. The boy opened the door. Calder did not return to work. No reason given. His supervisor, Alton Reed, later confirmed the report had been sealed on orders from above, though he could not identify from whom. By May 1893, the tenement's occupancy had dropped below 50%. The owner, Ephraim Cutter, offered reduced rents, waived deposits, and installed modern plumbing, but units continued to empty. A ledger from June lists 14 vacancies. The Harris apartment remained untouched. Letters began arriving at City Hall, unsigned, written in trembling cursive, claiming the boy was visible in dreams, not speaking, not moving, just watching. One letter, dated June 12th, stated, "I have never met him, but I see him each night in the chair. He knows I'm writing this. The gaslight never goes out." The mayor's office issued no statement. Instead, it redirected inquiries to the Department of Health. which then referred them to an internal sub-office labeled Environmental Factors, Behavioral Subset. When an archivist attempted to locate the sub-office in 1926, no such designation existed. On July 3, 1893, Catherine Harris failed to appear at the market for the third week in a row. The grocer, Mr. Feldstein, noted in his journal, "Always came on Wednesdays, exact change. Quiet. This month, nothing." He attempted delivery and found the door of 3C locked. Through the keyhole, he said he saw only flickering light. Their final report that month came from the building's former janitor, Pietro Morelli, who had returned briefly to collect tools he'd left behind. He wrote a letter to his cousin in Palermo, transcribed later by the cousin's son. "I went up for the hammer. I passed his door. I did not mean to look, but I heard something, a low tone like humming, but without breath. I turned my head. The flame inside was moving, but everything else was still. The light bent, cousin. It curved toward the chair." The summer of 1893 brought a period of stifling heat to New York City. Horses collapsed in the streets. Tenement air turned sour, thick with the smell of sweat and spoiled food. But the apartment at 3C remained as it always had, sealed, lit, and inexplicably still. Tenants who had once tolerated the anomaly began to avoid even speaking its number aloud. Catherine Harris was last seen publicly on July 22nd, entering the First National Bank on Bowery. She withdrew $20 in silver coin and asked the clerk if they could wrap the coins in cloth, not paper. When asked for a reason, she replied, "It will weigh less for him." The teller, Joseph Linden, later told investigators she appeared healthy but stiff, like she was holding her breath the whole time. After that, no one saw her again for nearly a month. The mail stacked at the door. A note from the city census office remained untouched on the hallway floor. No sounds came from within, not even the usual hum of the gaslight. On the night of August 12th, a resident named Elsie Morton, who lived directly below, heard a distinct series of knocks, precise, slow, evenly spaced, 5 times in a row. She claimed they came from directly above. When she rapped her ceiling in return, nothing followed. No creaking, no footsteps, only silence. 3 days later, Elsie Morton was taken to St. Luke's Hospital after suffering what was described as a waking delirium. She insisted Matthew Harris had visited her in her sleep. "He stood in the hallway," she said. "I woke and he was there, but not inside. The gaslight was behind him." It made his face flat. Physicians dismissed her claims as heat-induced hallucinations, and she was released after 2 days. She left the building the same week. Meanwhile, a new file was opened at the Office of Municipal Records under the classification Tenement Anomalies, Unresolved. The file number, 78-1893C, was referenced in 3 interdepartmental memos, but disappeared from all official archives after 1896. A surviving page, retrieved from a retired clerk's effects, includes a handwritten note. "Too many eyes on this one. Recommend containment over clarification." In September, a former student of Dr. Garrison's Miss Ada Leclerc conducted an unsanctioned observation from the adjacent building's rooftop. Her background was in child neurology, but she had recently taken a post at the Women's Medical College. She kept a detailed diary of her attempt to understand the Harris phenomenon. From her notes dated September 4th, "He is there, always there, light on, always the same strength. But tonight the light stuttered, not a flicker, not a dim, but a momentary recoil, as if the flame was pulled inward and pushed back out. In that instant, the window darkened, and then everything returned. I could not see him for a full second. It was like the room blinked." Leclerc returned each evening for 10 days, sketching what she could see from her vantage point. On the 7th night, she noted movement, not from Matthew, but from a curtain on the opposite side of the room, one not visible from the hallway. She wrote, "It waved, but there was no breeze. The window is sealed. I saw no one else inside." Yet something passed behind him. Her drawings were sent to a colleague at the New York Infirmary for Women and Children. The envelope arrived, but the sketches had been removed. In their place was a single slip of paper, bearing only the phrase, "Leave it where it sits." The handwriting did not match Leclerc's, the colleagues, or any hospital personnel. On October 1, 1893, an agent from the Bureau of Internal Statistics, an entity tasked with tracking unusual census inconsistencies, arrived at Orchard Street unannounced. His name was Mr. Ansel Reed, and he posed as a census auditor. His first report was filed by hand that evening and contained 3 paragraphs, all redacted within 2 years. What remains is a solitary phrase scrawled in the margin. No sound when I opened the door, none at all. Not even the hinges. According to one surviving janitorial record, the gas light in apartment 3C was observed to dim at exactly 3:10 a.m. on October 4th and remain faint for 9 minutes. In that time, 2 tenants in the building recorded separate entries in personal journals describing waking suddenly with pressure in their ears and a humming sensation in the teeth. Neither had spoken to the other. Neither had known of the report. Later that month, a new public school inspector named Teresa Dunn attempted to verify Matthew's truancy status. After failing to locate his file at St. Patrick's, she visited the Harris home in person. She was met not by Catherine, but by a young girl, Margaret, who stood in the doorway and said nothing. According to Dunn, the girl's hands were clasped tightly together at her chest, and she trembled only slightly, as if bracing against cold. When asked to confirm Matthew's age, Margaret whispered, 10, always 10. Dunn asked for the exact date of birth. Margaret did not reply. The door closed. Dunn filed a routine status update. 2 days later, her report was revised with a note reading, "Family deceased. No further action required." The revision was unsigned. Her original copy, which she kept in her own journal, bore no such statement. By November 1893, the building had lost nearly all tenants. Units 1A through 4D were vacant. Cutter, the landlord, filed a petition for demolition. The city delayed the permit on grounds of occupant uncertainty. No record of further proceedings exists. The final known witness statement before the building's official closure came from a young girl named Harriet Brooks, age 12, whose family had lived on the 2nd floor for 7 years. In her oral testimony, later transcribed by her uncle, she said, "Mama told me not to speak of him, but he was in the window every night. The light looked tired, like it didn't want to burn anymore. One night I waved and he didn't wave back. But he wasn't looking at me either. He was looking at something above him. When asked to clarify, she added, something was moving on the ceiling. He watched it. His eyes moved with it, like it was crawling." The family left the next morning. On December 1st, 1893, 1 year to the day since the gaslight had last extinguished, it went dark again. This time for 23 minutes. No one approached the door. No sounds were heard. But at 11:42 p.m., a patrol officer walking the alley behind the tenement reported a sudden return of light so intense it illuminated the opposite building's brick facade. His name was Officer Hugh Ramsey. In his log, he wrote, "No matches struck. No lamps lit. It returned as if it had never left. Just there, same shape, same strength, no smoke." The following morning, when a maintenance worker attempted to verify gas flow to Unit 3C, he found the valve closed, not defective, manually closed. The only key belonged to the building owner, who had not entered the premises in over a month. When questioned by city officials, Cutter swore under oath, "No one has turned that valve in weeks." No one at all. On the morning of January 9, 1894, City Engineer Aldous Beeman received a directive to inspect the structural integrity of the Orchard Street tenement in advance of a final demolition permit. The building had been mostly abandoned for months, the remaining tenants long gone, save for a single occupied unit, 3C. The request was signed by an acting official of the Office of Tenement Affairs, whose name was later redacted in all surviving copies. Beeman, a practical man with 2 decades of service and a reputation for methodical work, arrived with blueprints, a lead pencil, and a measuring chain. He brought no assistant. His logbook, preserved in personal effects, documents the precise time he crossed the threshold into the building. 9:06 a.m. Dust clung to his boots within seconds. The air was stale and thick, the smell of rotting plaster mixing with something else, an odor like scorched wool and old water. In his first entry, he wrote, "Silence feels compressed. Walls hold breath. At apartment 3C, the door was shut but unlocked. There were no signs of tampering, no scratches or warping. Beeman turned the knob and stepped inside. His final entry from that day was a single phrase: chair moved. He was found 90 minutes later sitting at the bottom of the stairwell, hands gripping his knees, his pencil snapped in two beside him. He was unable to speak for nearly 12 hours. When language returned, all he could say repeatedly was, "It wasn't empty. It should have been empty." Following his collapse, the city temporarily halted demolition and issued an internal summons for inspection under Emergency Code 11A, typically reserved for buildings with unexplained environmental hazards. The following morning, 3 men entered the building: Officer Isaac Reeve, Health Inspector Lionel Mass, and a junior stenographer named Thomas Lowry. None had prior experience with the Harris case. Their objective was to document any health or safety violations that could expedite removal of the structure. They were instructed not to engage the occupant. They entered apartment 3C at 8:42 a.m. What they encountered was not what any of them expected. The first room, what had been described in dozens of reports as spotless and cold, was now in disarray. The floorboards were warped, buckled in places. The gaslight was extinguished. Dust covered every surface in a fine, glittering layer, as if the air itself had been ground into powder. The wallpaper had peeled from the corners, revealing small, blackened impressions beneath. Reeve reached for one and brushed it lightly with a gloved hand. It crumbled on contact, leaving a soot-like smear on his palm. In the far corner, the chair stood empty. For the first time in documented memory, Matthew Harris was not in the room. Lowry, trained in shorthand, noted everything aloud. No child in residence, no gaslight. Room unoccupied but appears recently disturbed. Debris suggests movement within last 12 hours. His voice wavered, and Mars interrupted, directing him to stop speaking for a moment. They proceeded cautiously into the adjoining room, which had been locked in prior visits, and described by neighbors only through glimpses. A kitchen, possibly, or a rear chamber with no known purpose. Reeve pried the warped door with a crowbar. The latch snapped. Inside they found what had once been a pantry, now converted into a narrow passage. The walls were lined with old sheets of newspaper, dates ranging from 1882 to 1887, all pasted in overlapping layers. Some were scorched around the edges. Others were marked with symbols, loops, crosses, small ink blots in sequence. The passage was barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. Lowry noted, "Structure not on blueprint. Improvised addition. Newspaper used as wall lining. Purpose unclear." He coughed twice. The air inside was denser than the rest of the apartment. Mars lit a match to inspect the ceiling. The flame bent sideways unnaturally, as if pulled by a current that could not be felt. At the end of the passage, they found a wooden hatch set into the floor. It was nailed shut with 6 rusted spikes. No handle. Reeve, against orders, forced it open with a pry bar. What lay beneath was not a crawl space, but a hidden compartment, roughly 4 feet deep, lined with boards that had darkened over time. At the base was a small cot, a ceramic bowl and a child's journal, leather-bound and buckled by moisture. The journal's pages were filled with blocky handwriting, some lines scrawled, others neat. Most of the entries read like lists: numbers, times, dates. Others described sensations. Fingers won't stop trembling today. Gaslight too loud. Can't blink. It hurts to keep looking, but it's worse when I don't. One entry dated May 2nd, 1889 read, "She says I must stay in the light. If I leave the light, it will come." Another, later in the book, simply said, "I've seen it now. It has my face." Lowry stopped reading aloud. Mars reached for the ceramic bowl, tipped it slightly, and saw that it held a scrap of cloth soaked in an amber fluid. It smelled faintly of alcohol and something bitter. Beneath the cloth were coins, silver dollars, each wrapped tightly in linen. One bore the initials M.H. carved lightly into its surface. There was no sign of Matthew in the compartment, no sign of recent occupancy. But the space bore heat, and a low ticking sound emanated from beneath the boards. Reeve tapped with his boot. The noise ceased instantly. They returned to the main room. The gaslight had reignited. They had not heard it hiss. They had not seen it flare. It was simply on, same dull glow, same flickering stillness. The chair was no longer empty. Matthew sat once again, hands folded, eyes wide. Lowry let out a noise, half gasp, half question, but no one answered. Mars stepped forward, stopped, and reached for his notebook. Reeve stared at the boy he would later write in his final report. He hadn't changed. Not older, not smaller. Like a picture someone forgot to take down. They remained in the room for 27 minutes, unsure of protocol, unsure whether to speak. When Lowry finally whispered, "Do you know where you've been?" The boy did not move. He did not blink. Only when Mars asked, "What is this place?" did the gaslight pulse. Not flicker, not dim, it expanded and shrank once like a breath. They left without further questioning. The hatch was resealed, the passage closed. The journal and bowl were taken into evidence. When the report reached City Hall, it was marked, "Classified Directive D Black, no further access permitted." No demolition took place. The building was condemned, but not destroyed. The door to apartment 3C was nailed shut from the outside. Witnesses say the light stayed on. On January 17, 1894, a closed-door hearing was held in a side room of the Department of Buildings. Present were 2 deputy commissioners, a representative from the Department of Health, 1 cleric from the diocese, and a man whose name did not appear on the attendance record. The purpose was to determine the status of 3C, specifically, what authority had the right to intervene in a case without legal precedent, where no crime had been alleged, no illness identified, and yet no ordinary conditions applied. Dr. Lionel Mars, visibly shaken, gave a brief oral testimony. He stated that the boy had not spoken, moved, or demonstrated hostility. Yet, it felt as though I had been spoken to, not with words, but with stillness. A silence that says, "You are not meant to be here." He refused to return to the apartment. Thomas Lowry submitted the confiscated journal, which was transcribed by a clerk in a locked room over 2 nights. Of the 127 entries, 49 referenced the light, 22 described the hunger in the dark, and 1, a page torn cleanly from the binding, was missing entirely. The index file for the transcript lists that missing page as entry 1 to 12. No duplicate exists. The journal's final page bore a note not in the boy's handwriting. It read, "Contain him, or contain what keeps him still." In response, the Office of Public Morals recommended indefinite isolation of the apartment. The Bureau of Gas and Energy attempted to shut off service, but 3 separate closures failed. At each attempt, the flow resumed within hours. On the final visit, an engineer named Bernard Kleist discovered the service pipe sealed with hardened resin, completely impassable, and yet the flame inside 3C remained lit. He refused to return to the building. The following week, an unauthorized party entered the property after dark. At 2:13 a.m., on January 24th, a team of 4 men, later identified as operatives from a private agency contracted by the Department of Civic Risk, forced the rear fire door and climbed the 3 flights to the Harris unit. The lead operative, Jonathan Trask, left behind an incident card clipped to his jacket, recovered days later. No bodies were found, no report was filed. The only evidence of their presence was a footprint in the hallway, marked with dust and turned at an angle, suggesting a sudden pivot away from the door. The residents of the building opposite claimed that the light in 3C pulsed for nearly 1 hour that night, at irregular intervals. One woman wrote in her diary, "It grew so bright, I could see the pattern of the boy's coat, but he never moved." The flame did. By February 1894, local press had begun asking questions. A journalist from the Tribune named Andrew Kell made 2 visits to the site. The first time, he walked the alley behind the building, sketching the layout. The second, he attempted to gain entry. According to his own notebook, later recovered in his desk drawer after his death in 1895, the front door opened on its own before he could knock. Inside, he wrote, the hallway smelled of copper and ammonia. The gas lights on the stairwell remained unlit. When he reached the 3rd floor, he reported a faint ticking sound from within apartment 3C, not loud, but so persistent that it settled into the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Kell's final entry. I saw him. I saw him through the crack in the door. He was not asleep. He was not awake. His hands were not his. The light did not want me there. His article was never published. The Tribune's editor-in-chief claimed the material had been lost during a typeset fire. There was no fire. Kell stopped writing for the paper the following month. In early March, Margaret Harris reappeared. She was seen standing on the steps of Holy Redeemer Church, hair tucked beneath a mourning veil, gloved hands trembling as she held a letter addressed to whoever is willing to listen. It was never mailed. The parish priest took it and locked it away. Years later, in a private interview, he recounted the contents. She wrote that she had not entered the apartment since 1891, that she heard her mother speak to someone who never answered, that she could feel heat coming through the floor at night, even in winter. She claimed the boy had changed in 1887 after a severe fever. He had stopped crying, stopped sleeping. That Catherine began speaking of a second presence that required constant vigilance. If he sleeps, her mother would say, it finds the cracks. She had insisted on keeping the light burning day and night. The same flame, never extinguished. Always fed. Margaret disappeared 2 days later. The letter was never seen again. By April 1894, the apartment was listed in official city documents as permanently inactive. The designation was applied to only one other property in the city, a quarantine station later decommissioned. No law supported the classification. It was accepted without question. Inside 3C, the chair remained. No one entered. The gaslight continued to burn. On April 22nd, a final inspection was ordered, not to examine the structure, but to remove any remaining materials of value. The team consisted of 2 porters, 1 documentarian and a municipal representative. They were instructed not to touch the child. If the child was present, they were to report back and await instruction. They arrived at 7 a.m. By 7:26, all 3 had exited the building. According to their supervisor's memorandum, the men refused to speak until signed waivers of immunity were processed. Their statements were recorded in a private session. The transcript is sealed. But in a surviving index summary, one note is visible beneath the heading Entry Point Observations. It reads, "He was there, but he was watching something else." Inside the apartment, they had found 3 objects on the table: a sealed envelope with no writing, a brass weight, and a shard of mirror wrapped in linen. The weight had been placed precisely in the center of the envelope, pinning it down. The mirror fragment, when unwrapped, was found to be dull, no reflection. When lifted to the face, it gave only a dim blur, like a fogged window. The envelope was never opened. It vanished from municipal custody by the end of the month. No one entered the apartment again. By the summer of 1894, the building was listed as vacant. The gaslight was still visible from the alley. Residents of the street below began avoiding that side of the block. Children dared each other to run up the stairs and knock. None succeeded. One final notation appears in the Department of Public Works archive, dated August 7, 1894. Routine review, tenement still standing. Unit 3C, light visible, no reported activity. Recommend indefinite closure. Beneath this, in a different hand, it is not ours to open. In early 1895, with the apartment at 3C still sealed and the gaslight unyielding, the City of New York initiated a quiet transfer of administrative responsibility. The tenement building was removed from public housing records and listed under private custodial oversight, a designation usually applied to consulate properties or medical quarantine sites. No explanation was offered to the press. When a journalist from the Herald requested the legal basis for the reassignment, he received a letter stamped, "No relevant files." Behind the scenes, a quiet war of jurisdiction had begun. 3 city departments, health, infrastructure, and education, claimed they no longer had authority. The Office of Public Morals declared the case outside its scope. The Archdiocese withdrew involvement entirely, citing a matter resolved in silence. This left no clear agency in charge of 3C, and yet inspections still occurred. Individuals whose names do not appear in employment records were seen entering the building in the early hours, always leaving empty-handed, always returning within days. By May, the building was padlocked and its perimeter fenced with iron bars. Officially, it was declared a property of ongoing technical review. Unofficially, it was referred to internally as the Quiet Unit. From 1895 to 1897, records thinned. The remaining tenants were relocated and sworn to silence under threat of forfeiture of city support. Some were given one-time payments, others disappeared from census documents entirely. The neighborhood began to forget. But memory lingered in smaller forms. Children born after the events were told not to play near the fence. They spoke in hushed tones about the light that never changed, about the stories of the boy who never slept, who watched from the window even when no one was home. School teachers corrected them. Shopkeepers turned away from such questions. But late at night, the alley behind the building remained strangely clean, untouched by wind or soot, as if preserved by some internal draft. In 1898, during a citywide audit of unclaimed municipal properties, a clerk named Francis Groves flagged the building at Orchard Street. When he sent a formal request to retrieve its deeds, he received an envelope with a blank page and a single phrase, handwritten in red: "Do not amend what is held in stillness." Groves filed a complaint. Within a month, he was reassigned to bridge inspection. That same year, 2 engineers reported visual anomalies during a rooftop survey of the Lower East Side. One, Ellis Powell, stated, "A strange effect at dusk. The apartment's windows reflect no sky. They absorb it. We watched clouds pass overhead, but nothing moved in the glass. It was like looking into dry water. No corrective action was taken." In 1899, a retired fire inspector, Howard Lamble, published a privately printed memoir titled The Rooms That Stay. He dedicated one chapter to 3C. The print run was limited to 50 copies, mostly given to friends and former colleagues. In the chapter, Lamble described his experience during the winter of 1893. He had not been permitted to enter the apartment, but had stood in the hallway during an inspection. He wrote, "There was a weight behind that door. Not pressure, but intention. Something in there was patient." A month after publication, Lamble suffered a sudden and unexplained breakdown. His family burned all remaining copies of the memoir. Only one is known to survive, preserved in a private collection with torn pages. That spring, the building was purchased in silence by a front organization known as Eastern Instruments and Storage, whose public charter listed only 3 services: containment, displacement, monitoring. The office was never occupied. Its mailing address led to a vacant lot, but a new lock was installed on the tenement. The gaslight continued to burn. In 1900, an internal memo from the Office of Building Archives, since lost but partially quoted in the private diaries of a former clerk, summarized the matter. There has been no documented movement in the apartment since early 1894. No meals delivered, no service accessed, and yet no decay observed. The light does not flicker, the chair is never empty, we cannot confirm his age. The phrase, "we cannot confirm his age," was underlined 3 times. There were no further investigative entries that year. In the absence of official word, stories filled the vacuum. Some said the boy had died, but his form remained. Others claimed he was never there to begin with, that the child had been a fiction devised by a government experiment or a religious enclave. But the facts resisted revision. Too many documents existed, too many names, too many statements from those who had no reason to lie. The journal, the chair, the valve sealed shut, each one a fact too solid to erase and too fragile to explain. By 1901, the alley behind the building had become a place of quiet pilgrimage. Not of faith, but of obsession. Men and women with no relation to the case would come and stand at the iron gate, sometimes for minutes, sometimes hours. They never approached, they never spoke. They watched the light. It had never dimmed. In 1902, the final year permitted for archival access under new city regulations, a graduate student from Columbia University submitted a request to study the case. His name was Abraham Keller, and his interest was academic. He believed the Harris file could serve as an example of late-century bureaucratic dysfunction. His petition was granted for one afternoon. He was granted access to 2 boxes. One was empty. The other contained a single object, the weight retrieved from the table during the 1894 inspection. Keller held it in his palm. He later wrote, "It was too warm, as if it had just left a pocket. I looked for markings. None. But when I closed my hand, I felt resistance, not from the metal but from the air around it, like I had disturbed something mid-thought. He returned the object. He filed no paper. 3 years later, Keller disappeared from public life. His name was removed from the university directory. The only reference to his existence appears in the back of a physics journal, where he is listed as a consultant on static fields. No one has entered the apartment since. The building still stands, fenced, sealed, and unclaimed. Some say the flame finally went out. Others insist it never did. But every so often, when the city is quiet and the wind shifts just right, a glow appears behind the third window of Orchard Street. A glow that does not waver, a glow that does not flicker, and behind it, a shape that never changes. In the spring of 1902, under the shadow of new municipal building codes and expanding urban development, a formal appeal was submitted to the City Council requesting the demolition of the Orchard Street tenement. The motion was filed by a junior attorney with no knowledge of the building's history. He had marked it for clearance, based solely on the age and vacancy status of the property. His appeal was approved without resistance. The demolition was scheduled for the last week of May. When the assigned crew arrived, led by Supervisor Jerome Haskins of East River Excavation, they found the fencing intact, the padlocks rusted but functional, the third-floor window visibly lit. Haskins, a veteran of dozens of similar demolitions, gave the order to breach the front door. No documentation remains of what happened inside. The only surviving trace is a single entry in Haskins's job log, scrawled unevenly in pencil. Interior compromised, chair occupied, stand by, do not proceed. The crew left before noon. No tools were unpacked, no permits were filed to reschedule. A week later, the demolition permit vanished from the public archive. The number was reassigned to an unrelated warehouse on 12th Street. No one filed a complaint. Haskins retired that same year and refused to speak publicly about the incident. In June, the building was removed from updated city maps. On revised prints, the lot was shaded grey, labelled Municipal Reservation. The surrounding blocks were redeveloped. Orchard Street changed shape, new angles, new addresses, but the building remained untouched, locked in place as if walled off by memory itself. By 1903, silence had returned in full. Official records ceased. The structure, though visibly intact, began to disappear from public consciousness. New residents passed without notice. Children no longer spoke of the boy in the window. The story became something told by the very old to the nearly old, haltingly, as if unsure whether it had happened at all. But the light continued. It was observed again in 1905 by a photographer documenting the architectural decay of the Lower East Side. He took 4 images of the alley behind the building. The first 3 showed nothing unusual: cracked walls, leaning fire escapes, piles of discarded boards. But the 4th, exposed at dusk, captured something else: a pale glow behind the third-floor glass, faint but steady. When the photograph was developed, a distortion appeared in the upper corner of the window. Not a figure, not a reflection, just a curvature in the light, as if something had shifted inside the emulsion. The photographer made no claims. He boxed the print and filed it away. It would not be seen again until 1971. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, only fragmentary references emerged. A brief line in a landlord registry from 1923. Unit 3C inaccessible, no key, light on. A casual remark in a sociological study from 1931. Former residents reported ongoing fear of light source at 113 Orchard, though cause remains undocumented. A marginal note in a 1946 police training manual: if called to 113 Orchard, refer to Central. Do not initiate contact. No calls were ever logged, no incident reports filed. Yet still the building was never condemned, never remodeled, never sold. It became part of the fabric of the city, a seam that no one dared tug. In the 1950s, amid the rise of historical preservation, several graduate researchers attempted to locate documents related to the Harris case. They found nothing. Files that had once been referenced in older footnotes were gone. Ledger numbers led to blank pages. Entire drawers were misfiled or empty. The journal recovered in 1894 had vanished from the municipal archive. Even the inspection photographs were gone, except for a single contact print showing only the outside of the building, undisturbed, window dark. One researcher, Ruth Traeger, persisted longer than the others. She compiled what she could into a dossier, dozens of interviews, unverified memos, half-burned letters. Her notes filled 2 boxes. In a taped message, she said, "Everything leads to that room, not just the boy. Everything they were afraid to say. It wasn't what he did. It was what stopped happening around him." She mailed the boxes to a colleague. They never arrived. The delivery receipt was signed by someone who did not exist. Ruth Traeger withdrew from public life in 1958. By the 1970s, the property had no address. Mail was returned. Service requests were rejected. The city, growing upward and outward, seemed to curve around it, like a rock in a flowing stream. Modern maps left the lot unnumbered. GPS systems marked it as a blank coordinate. It became a known unknown, accepted, referred to, but never acted upon. Tour guides stopped pointing it out. Locals made jokes. "You know who still pays rent up there?" One man laughed in 1981. The boy who never slept. But the laughter stopped when a blackout hit Lower Manhattan in July that year. Streetlights failed, buildings darkened, traffic signals went dead. All of Orchard Street was without power, except for a single window, glowing steady through the night. The building was not on the grid. The following day, the utility company marked the report as an error. In 1993, the Department of Urban Preservation filed an internal study on architectural anomalies. The author included a short paragraph near the end. "Structure at former Orchard Street location remains untouched, unknown ownership. External examination only. No visible deterioration. One window lighted continuously." The file was never digitized. 25 years later, in 2018, a documentary crew attempting to film long-abandoned properties for a web series located the building. They set up cameras from the adjacent rooftop. 3 shots were captured before power failed. When reviewed, the footage revealed no light, no glow, just an empty window. But in the audio, under the ambient sound, a faint ticking was heard. Not mechanical, organic. It pulsed at 9-second intervals. The footage was not used. Today the site is unmarked. The fence remains. The windows layered in soot and age show nothing to the naked eye. But from time to time, those who pass by claim to see a shape seated in the corner. Pale, unmoving, waiting. And when asked what they felt in that moment, they all say the same thing. They were being watched by someone who didn't need to blink. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way, we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.